raw, uncut, and unapologetic. Welcome to Men Talking Mindfulness with your hosts John McCaskill and Will Schneider. Here we focus on helping men and those with men in their lives solve some of life's complex challenges through understanding the practices of mindfulness and how they can help. Each episode is in an environment free of judgment and criticism, with a focus on authenticity and inner peace. Let's dig in.
Virtues are formed in man by his doing the actions, said Aristotle. The writer Will Durant interpreted this as, we are what we repeatedly do, therefore excellence is not an act, but a habit. Meaning, excellence is not what we do once, it's a way of life. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, habits. Breaking the bad ones and starting the good ones. Welcome to Men Talking Mindfulness, a show where we delve into the crossroads of mindfulness and masculinity, nurturing both health and prosperity for the modern man and for those with men in their lives. I'm John McCaskill, coming to you from Colorado Springs, and I'm joined by my co-host there, Will Schneider in New York City. Today we have the privilege of featuring a remarkable individual, Singh, who is not only a successful businessman, but also the founder of Ultrahabits and an ultra-endurance athlete. RJ has a personal journey of overcoming chronic dysfunction that encompassed violence, crime, youth detention, jails, and chronic addiction. With the invaluable support of mentors and various frameworks, he embarked on a transformative path. Drawing from his own experiences, RJ developed a unique framework that empowered him to rebuild and refocus his mind, his body, and spirit, ultimately unlocking limitless possibilities. He firmly believes that by committing to and dedicating oneself to the evolution of the mind, body, and spirit complex, individuals can experience growth and prosperity in all aspects of life. This achievement necessitates intention, discipline, and the cultivation of solid habits. Get ready for a deep dive into habits, how they are created, how do we break the bad ones that don't serve us, and what it takes to stick with the ones that help us to develop that competitive advantage. RJ, welcome to the show, brother. I know we had all sorts of technical difficulties there at the beginning, but welcome here, brother. Good to see you.
Yeah, I literally was about to break my computer, so I wasn't too mindful before this whole introduction. But man, that was a wonderful introduction, John. Thanks for having me on the show, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Will.
So great, man. So great to have you, brother. And I'm going to dive in here in a second. But first, Will, good to see you, brother. It's been a while since we did a live show, and we've had our retreat since we did our last show, live show, and we, that was just an incredible experience. And then after that, we linked up in New York City during Fleet Week in New York City, ran into some fellow sailors, and we supported the Children of Fallen Patriots, an amazing organization, at their fundraising gala. And now we are finally getting back into our live shows. And I tell you, it's obvious that it's been a while because there's some bugs that we're working out in audio, in technical, and blah, blah, blah. But we're not going to bore our audience with all that. So, Will, man, good to see you, brother. How you been?
Good. It's good to be back. Thank you, RJ, for joining us. Hey, if you're enjoying the show, hey, thank you for taking a minute or two and leaving us a review. We'd really appreciate that. And you can also find us on our YouTube and subscribe, to make sure you hit the little bell and get the notification for new content. We actually hired an editor to help us cut some of our show into these little snackable snippets that you can munch on when you need them. So subscribe, and we appreciate that. And you can find us by searching for Men Talking Mindfulness over on YouTube. And what we do to start the show, RJ, and you need it, I need it, we all need it. We're just going to do like a 5-breath kind of grounding practice just to kind of help us to really sink into this conversation, into the moment. So let's just start with a nice little exhale out of our mouth. Close the eyes if that's available for you and safe for you. Good. Just take a nice big inhale through the nose. Big breath. Keep going. And exhale, very slow exhalation through the mouth. Nice and easy and smooth. Again, in for 5 seconds. 4, Take that little pause, get intentional, and then very smooth exhale out. And again, in for 5. Big belly breath. Deep into your belly. Exhale, let it go. Nice and smooth, easy. Relax your face, your jaw, your shoulders if they need to be. And then 2 more. In 5. Out, easy. 1 more in. Exhale, let it go. And just keep your eyes closed for a moment and notice if that's changed anything, if you feel more grounded, if you're a little more relaxed. And I just like to take this moment to really kind of check in with the self and just really begin to recognize and know that the breath can really change how you're feeling, what you're thinking, and will definitely lend itself to the actions that you want. All right, let's jump in. John, go for it. Or RJ, if you want to open up with something for us, that'd be awesome. Thanks for coming again today and joining us.
Well,
Yeah, I'll jump in with some questions, RJ, just to set a foundation for you. But I also got to tell you, over and above all the bugs that we've been working, the Air Force Academy is maybe, I don't know, a couple miles that way. And they've got graduation tomorrow. And they've got the Thunderbirds, the F-16 jets flying over, rehearsing for graduation flight tomorrow. So you guys may hear it and the audience may hear it. Hey, it is what it is. We're rolling with raw, uncut, and unapologetic.
Exactly.
So anyway,
it's the way
RJ,
to go. It's the way to go.
That's the way to go, man. It makes life fun,
the only way to go.
more relaxed, more authentic. So anyhow, RJ, man, again, honor to have you. I know you and I text one another regularly in this group that we call the Uncommon, who Jeff Harris and Mark Paskey are a group or members of, and they were on our show just a few months ago, not even a few months ago, probably a month ago now. But RJ, for you, reflecting on that bio that I read at the beginning, that challenging past, what were the primary factors that served as a catalyst for you leading into those difficulties? What happened there? And just tell us a little background there. How did you get out of that, man? How did you get into that, and how did you get out of that challenging background?
Yeah. So I think, as I reflect, previously, even previous to my addiction, there was definitely a hole in the soul, right? There was something there that I was looking for, searching, and there was definitely what we call in the rooms of recovery a profound sense of dis-ease. And that dis-ease, that uncomfortability, that yearning and searching took me to weird and horrible places, right? And I acted out, and I had signs of addiction even before I undertook any substances or alcohol. And the moment that I had a drink, I was 13 years old, and there's a lot between, the age of 5 and 6 to 13 in terms of how I acted out. And when I reflect on how I just felt irregular or incompatible to this world in many ways. But the moment I had a drink at the age of 13, something came alive. And I remember thinking to myself, I will never be able to quit this.
Oh, wow. Right off the bat.
13.
Right off the bat, immediately. It was profound. It was a spiritual experience, drinking alcohol for me. Wow. And then I pursued that. I pursued that numbness. I pursued that feeling, and that pursuit took me into crime. It took me into facilities, into jails, into prisons, and yeah, that was kind of that whole piece. And we can unpack that to the extent that you want, John and Will. fast forward, I arrived here in Australia. I'm 26. I grew up in the United States, but I was born in Australia, and I I got a hold on my green card, so I'd never become a U.S. naturalized citizen, even though I'm American by culture and by everything really. I mean, I arrived in the U.S. when I was 3. Similar
Mm.
background to you, John. We were
Yeah.
immigrants, and I got there, but you know, by the time I was 17 or 18, I was already incarcerated. And immigration INS, they used to call it, I think before Homeland Security or whatever, or I think they changed the name. It was INS at the time, came and saw me when I was 18. I was doing just a 2-month, 3-month sentence, and they really tried to scare me, as to, you're not actually a citizen. We can kick your ass out of the country. And, my family, they had become U.S. naturalized citizens, and I just was running the streets, so I never bothered. So by the age of 26, I'm a multiple convicted felon, and
Wow.
I have to renew my green card. And my lawyers are like, dude, they're not going to do it.
Wow.
And I end up back in Australia through a set of really bad circumstances. One-way ticket. I end up here at the age of 26, and things got profoundly and aggressively worse
Oh, wow.
because, now I'm in a foreign environment. I've got a criminal mindset. I don't have any life skills, and I come to Australia, and within 3 months, I've set up an apartment. I'm working a regular day job, and I'm all kinds of crazy in my psychology, and I've got a sick soul, and I'm trying to like pretend I'm Joe Regular, and for 18 months in Australia, things got progressively worse until ultimately I came to a rock bottom, and we can unpack that too.
Yeah, let's do that. So at this point, you're still addicted to alcohol. What else are you addicted to? And
Yeah.
yeah, let's unpack that.
Yeah, so I got off the drugs prior to coming to Australia. I was a crystal meth addict, but also
Wow.
a crystal meth dealer.
Mm.
And I then went to my primary addiction. I quit crystal meth but continued to sell it. And I just picked up, I had been drinking the whole time. And the reality was that I was a primary alcoholic that used crystal meth and other things to kind of keep me drinking 24/7,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
I always had a beer in my hand or was drinking. Yeah. And
Mm.
when I came to Australia, I was drug free, and I knew I couldn't use drugs. Like for me, getting off of drugs was a major win, right? But the the sadness, the grief, the confusion, the immaturity, the lack of life skills. 26 at the time, I thought I was old. But as you get older,
Right.
you realize, how you're still a kid, really, in many
Yeah.
ways. And not only was I a kid, I kind of lived in this subculture of criminality and the drug scene in California. So I didn't really have any real world experience. And I started going to the seediest bars. I was living in
Mm.
Brisbane, Australia, and I was trying to recapture the element that I was used to in California. So my bars in Brisbane, Australia they were strip clubs, and they were seedy, and it was where
Mm.
I felt comfortable. And I was just moving further into the abyss, man. And I started to psychologically and spiritually and emotionally deteriorate quite quickly when I came to Australia.
Wow.
And it was
Oh,
alcohol. Yeah.
what turned it all? What was the moment that when you woke up
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
everything
Mhm.
started to change, or you
Yeah.
realized that this is not my path?
I was here for about 18 months. And within 18 months of being here in Australia, I was facing jail here for
For
three
your
DUI.
crystal meth?
No, three. I wasn't selling drugs here in Australia. I was
Okay.
working, but I got 3 DUIs in like a year. And in Australia, they're very, it's quite different. Like, particularly in the state I was in Victoria, and I was facing actual prison here. And I just remember, I came back from the police station because they told me, they had summoned me. I went there and they were like, look, we found that, that you've got other DUIs in this part of the state, and you've got 3, and it's highly likely you're going to be going to prison here in Australia. They obviously didn't know my background in the US. And I remember coming back to my apartment, and I just had, my shoulders sank. I looked up in the sky, and it wasn't like a call to God, but I just had this moment of clarity and saw my life and everything for what it was. And the realization that I would potentially have to tell my mother that not only did I have to come to Australia, never to be able to go back to the US, but now I'm facing the same situation here. And it was the more religious members in 12 steps will call that divine grace.
Yeah.
Some people will call that a moment of clarity. But my ego shattered at that moment. Wow. And followed by an obsession. The obsession to drink was lifted.
Wow.
Pretty much immediately. Immediately. It was gone.
And have you had a drink since then?
No.
Incredible, man. Congratulations. No. That's amazing. So
yeah.
From that point of clarity, or whatever it is that you want to call it, where do you go, and what do you do? Yeah. I know you've since founded Ultrahabits. You've become has the ultra athlete in you. Is that your new addiction? Did you jump right into that? I mean, where do we go from there?
No, and that's a really good question. I mean, I think we have a lot of people in the ultra endurance community that don't get well, and they use it as an outlet, but they never really learn to sit still. And that's a whole nother piece, right?
Yeah.
But I'm glad I didn't go into ultra immediately. Running was a big part of early sobriety. I'm a good runner. I'm built for it. And, I ran a lot, particularly in the evenings, because that's when I would have drank, and I'd run just fucking crazy distances for someone that hadn't been running. Right now, I was still smoking like 40 cigarettes a day or whatever, right? Like, it was crazy. But to your question, I knew where to go to get sober. I had been exposed to 12-step recovery since I was 16. In the US, they're happy to put us in 12-step based recovery very early. And I grew up close to Oakland, California, and I'd gone to a 12-step recovery center there when I was maybe 16, and again when I was 18, and again when I was 24. And so I went into 12-step recovery, and 2 things happened for me that I think really helped me this time stay sober. I went into 12-step recovery. I was ready, and I knew it worked. And there was a very strong character in this particular meeting I went to who was evangelic, quite controversial in the 12-step community here in Australia. But that was one thing. But I met a couple entrepreneurs, one in particular who was a young guy, and I was working as a sales rep in his company, and he had just moved across from being the CFO to being in the GM of commercial, like heading up the sales team. And for whatever reason, man, my last debacle, my last drunk, I had texted him about 4 or 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and he was new to the role, and I just quit. And I think it was like a cry for help. And he
Mm.
called me the next day. I think he called me on a Sunday. He told me I did it on a Saturday, but early morning he called me on a Sunday. He's like, "Look, let me give you a piece of advice. Don't make life-changing decisions when you're drunk at 4 or 5 in the morning."
Mm.
And that had been like a week or so before I had this come to Jesus moment, right? And so, you know, he and I had met around this time of me contemplating, what I'm going to do with my life. And I told him everything. I told him this story that I'm telling you. And he believed that I had some strong capability, and he thought I would potentially like a superstar, right? But I just had no uh, pathway to get there. And basically what he said to me, we're sitting and having a coffee, and I paraphrase, like, "You've got something special. You clean your shit up, you get sober, and I'll help you find greatness," right? Like that was
Wow.
it. And he was a natural teacher. Like he liked tough cases. Like there was a lot of, we're still great friends now, but like he was a fixer. So in many ways, I think I tied into some of his dysfunction too, but it worked. You know what I mean? Like he liked the challenge of fixing people and taking things on. He was a natural teacher. He was young. It was weird. He had spent time in the San Francisco Bay Area where I grew up. He loved it there. He was a 49ers fan. Like there was a whole lot of things that were really weird. So I think two things happened. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No.
One, I had a pathway to get sober through 12-step, but here's someone offering me a pathway to become a successful human being. He's offering me a pathway to create a new identity. That was
Right.
what I never had before. So whenever I went to a rehab or whenever I tried to get clean, I'd come out of those rehabs with no alternative path. And so the drug
Right.
dealing life always called me back. I was addicted to that way of life more than or just as much as drugs and alcohol, to
Wow.
be honest with you. So I think, yeah, these two things were really a catalyst for change.
So, so your mentor, who took you under his wing and helped you to get to where you are, at least get on the path to where you are. If you saw yourself as a mentor right now to our audience, I got two questions for you, RJ. If you had to tell our audience 2 to 3 things that someone must do to break a bad habit, what would those 2 to 3 things be?
Yeah, I think, and this is the piece that you can't impart on someone. There has to be a fundamental willingness to
Mm.
do whatever it takes to shift. And no
Mm.
human being can create that for someone else, right? Like no one can. And so let's start with the baseline of there is a willingness,
Okay.
right? Like there's got to be a willingness, and there's got to be this this energy towards change. I would say that we have to get very clear on what or who our idealized self looks like. We have to become future orientated to the extent that who we want to become is stronger than who we are today,
Wow. That's powerful. Thank you.
right? Like that has to be, because when we start to embark on that change, whatever change looks like for an individual, for me, physicality is the best and clearest pathway to personal transformation. What I mean by that is like fitness, right?
Right.
Like there's so much there's existential pressure created when we go down a fitness journey, which requires us to change. You have to get up early, you have to prepare, you've got to develop discipline. It's a crucible, and that's why I like crucibles, because they create the pressure required to change.
Mm.
However, if you don't know, or you don't have an idealized self, if you don't know where the target is or where to aim and what you're moving towards, you won't sustain that path. So what happened for me is Matthew started to create an archetype of who I wanted to become, a successful business person. I started to see it and taste it and feel it. Like I knew I could get there. And I was willing, because I was so desperate in shifting my identity and how I saw myself and how others saw me. I was willing to do what I needed to do to get there. So I think the first step is to get clear on who are we and who do we want to become.
Right on, man. Well, and it sounds like that you kind of answered my next question with that same one. So I was just going to ask, how do you end bad habits, and then how do you start new habits? And it sounds like that clarity is the foundation for both for stopping the bad habits and for identifying the good habits that you want to pursue, but not only identifying, but actually starting the pursuit. So I think that clarity is a great way to start. Go ahead.
John, our willpower will align with what we see as good. If we don't value something, our willpower will not back it. Right? And so we need to understand what those values are and what we value and what we see as good. And then our willpower will support that. What will ultimately happen is when we're very clear on who we are and who we're becoming, we won't have to use willpower as much, right? But at the beginning, when we're commencing a change piece, there's a lot of willpower, and there's a lot of there's a lot of intentionality in terms of needing to shift from a suboptimal habit to a more beneficial habit. But ultimately, once you start to get on that path of moving towards your values and living your values, these micro habits and these shifts of habits from suboptimal to better habits, they're not as difficult.
That path, I mean, that path becomes clearer, right? Not only is your mind clear, but the path becomes clear. And I've found that in my own life with what I'm doing now, and with what Will and I are doing. I never, 10 years ago, if someone had told me that I'd be running a podcast talking about meditation and mindfulness, I never would have guessed it. But at some point, it becomes super clear. And Will, I think I can hear you clicking. Will's having some technical difficulties, and he's not feeling great either. So he's a champ, and he's here, man. He's powering through it. So we'll see if he comes back. But anyhow, that clarity, when you get clear of mind, that path opens up. So now let's talk about balance, man. With you having gone down that path, now you've got a clear mind, and you've somewhat got a clear path in mind. How do you get to where you start Ultra Habits? And now that you've got Ultra Habits going, being that ultra endurance athlete and a dedicated family man, I know that about you. I've seen your posts. I follow you on social media. You're a dedicated family man. How do you go from that sense of clarity, that place where you're at, that clear path, to finding Ultra Habits, getting into the ultra endurance athlete, and then balancing those two between your family and your professional life? I guess balancing three: the Ultra Habits, ultra endurance, and your personal life.
Yeah. So like I was thinking about this last night. Like I sometimes I don't know how I do everything I do sometimes. Like I was kind of thinking about this yesterday. Like I'm like, oh, this is a bit weird, right? Like and I'm seem to be pretty well integrated. There wasn't a lot of balance initially on the journey of that initial sobriety piece. Like I was working my ass off, like, and it was good, right? Like it gave me a renewed sense of purpose. And I went back and studied. I did a really tough executive MBA program. It's like 4 years, and like I did all these different things, right? Started to run ultra marathons. When I finished my MBA, I took 6 months off, and then I started to look for a new crucible and decided that it should be physical. And I found ultra marathons, and I did that for religiously and competitively, and became sponsored for 2 to 3 years. And then I had a second child. So family's a priority, and I'm around my family physically a lot because I work from home, and I have these micro interactions which are good. And my youngest is in, I guess, what they would call kindergarten, and or sorry, my oldest, and then my youngest will be starting daycare soon. She's 3. My wife is opening up a hair salon, so she's starting a business up here. We live in a kind of a mountain range, which is pretty isolated, and I'm starting a new business as well. I don't run ultras right now. And the reason I don't run ultras is because the amount of training required to compete removes me from the household. And I just don't have the energy required to be present and give my children and my wife the right energy. And a lot of addicts and a lot of people that are built like me will go over the edge, and they definitely can and will lose those in their lives. I am doing burpees, as we talked about earlier, and looking to break the Guinness Book of World Record burpees. However, that was done with a lot of thought in terms of what type of exercise it was, because I'm stationary and I'm around my kids when I'm training. I don't have to go on
I've seen you doing the burpees with them there.
Yeah, they're
awesome.
there, and
Yep.
and it sucks. And I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons why I'm doing it. It's an exercise that you can do in a rehab, in a prison. I mean, there's a lot in that, and I needed to do something physical because I could start to see that I needed a new crucible, and it needed to be physical to kind of realign me. But I chose burpees, with great intention. So I guess to answer your question, I continually evaluate my life on a weekly basis. And you might talk to my wife and she may tell you I'm still crazy and I don't have it right. But
Mine too.
yeah, right. Like it's hard. It's not easy. But I can say this: I'm definitely not lopsided, and in all these pursuits I'm doing, as impulsive as I am, and I like to try new things and experiment. Ultimately, I stick to the things that really matter, and I'll let go of the things that aren't shifting the needle. And I make sure it comes together in a way where I'm spending time with my family and doing the things I need to be doing in terms of giving people the energy required in my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how do you reach that? I mean, the show is about mindfulness, right? So it's not necessarily about meditation, but it sounds as though you've had a moment. I know we've already talked about your moment of clarity, but even throughout that and throughout what you're doing now and balancing that ultra endurance athlete side of you, even if you're not going and doing ultras anymore, you're still doing ultra things, right? The world record of burpees while you're managing and running a business. So you had to have practiced some level of mindfulness. So that mindfulness, how does that come into play? And then if you've ever read, The Power of Habit or Atomic Habits, I'm sure you've read both of those. A lot of power comes with consistency when you're building those habits and starting small and kind of building that. How does mindfulness come into play? And then how does that help you to stay consistent in your efforts?
Yeah. So I've, and you and I talked about this, when you had that moment with your daughter, when I think, you started getting upset with her or whatever, and you realized, she's just a baby, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I, I've come back to meditation, and I was a meditator and with a formal practice, Tibetan practice, Tibetan Buddhism. And then when I had my first son, I lost that practice after time because it's just the chaos of having babies
Life.
and
Yeah,
in life. Yeah. And,
yeah.
and then I just went back to movement, which was more running. But recently, within the last 6 months, I've gotten back into meditation, and I find that evening meditation works for me. Even though I'm tired, it's when all the kids are down and there's no risk of disruption. I feel the risk of disruption doesn't do my practice well. Like if I'm sensing there could be disruption. So I have a formal
I
practice
feel
of
you, brother.
meditation. Do you know what I mean? Like
I
just
get it,
the
man. Like when I wake up
anticipation
in the
and
morning. Yep.
yeah, it's just the anticipate. And even when I'm meditating in the evening, my son will wake up, he'll come out for more food. And now I just incorporate that into the practice. So there is a formal practice back in my life, but in
Nice.
terms of how am I mindful in the grander sense, it's through weekly auditing. I reflect at the end of my week or at the beginning of my week on a Sunday as to how I'm really uh, operating, and I try to be objective. A lot of the times we think we're operating well. You can ask our wives; they'll tell you something differently. Like we think we're balanced and harmonious, and I'm screamed at the kids 5 minutes ago. I was off my head. Like reflecting on that. I do a daily journal, but reflecting on that weekly to see like, have I been giving my energies to the right things? Like living a mindful life, right? Like I think that's to your point. Like there's a mindfulness practice, but then there's a mindfulness that we can have in terms of how do we live? Are we like
Right.
aware? Are we sleep at the wheel, or are we actually awake, looking at our behavior and our conduct? And
Yeah.
for me, that's important. And I do that on a weekly basis, man.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, man. Like what I always tell people when I talk about mindfulness and meditation, I say mindfulness doesn't necessarily have to be a meditation. You can eat a meal mindfully. You can work mindfully. You can have a conversation like we are having mindfully and live that mindful life. Mindfulness, in my opinion, and what I've found, is a way of living, and then you've got the formal practice. And those two can definitely supplement one another, but they don't have to be one and the same. So you're living that life mindfully, finding that balance. So here comes Will again. Here we go. Let's see if he's feeling any better. And how's it
Oh,
going,
there
Will?
you
Can you
go.
hear us, man? Yeah. Anyways, but the bugs continue. So anyway, rolling forward, man. So this mindfulness, and I know you're living that mindfulness as a family man, like we talked about. Um, Bringing that into Ultra Habits. Tell us what Ultra Habits is and how you incorporate mindfulness and habits in the corporate setting, and how you would encourage someone to bring both of those into the corporate setting.
Yeah. So Ultra Habits is a culmination, aggregation of uh, being an ultra endurance athlete, being an executive, and being a person that lives a mindful, performance orientated life. Like it's a sum of the learning across all of it, and an attempt to access more information through conversations like this for the audience, right? So really it was kind of like, how do I sum up everything that I've learned, but also continue to learn, not only for myself but for a community very similar to what you guys are doing, right? And there was so much learning as an ultra endurance runner, because it's hard. What makes it hard is when you're also an executive too. Like if I was just an ultra endurance athlete that was doing it professionally, in and itself, you can sleep during the day, you can rest, you can take it a bit easy. It's, that ultra runners and people that are generally professional ultra runners are kind of hippie in nature, a bit like your alternative sports like rock climbing, and there's a bit of that. But for those of us that are like have to do a 3-hour run and then go and lead a business at 8 or 9 a.m., how do you do that? And then how do you do that successfully? How do you then parent? How do you do all these things that are moving parts and sometimes in opposition? And that's what we focus on at Ultrahabits. It's like the executive is expected to peak perform far longer than any athlete. What information, what learnings in the form of, systems and habits and behaviors and attitudes can they incorporate to not only be successful in their business, but in their lives?
Now, taking that, one step further, or I guess maybe not even one step further, tying it into this, I know one thing that really people struggle with in regards to habits is they convince themselves that they can't break the bad habits, or they convince themselves that they can't attain the good habits, right? They have this negative narrative in their minds. How do you change someone's narrative, whether it's through Ultrahabits or just through your podcast or everything else that you're doing? How do you change that negative narrative in your mind or other people's minds so that they can start working towards this excellence?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, John. So everyone has to bear their own cross, right? Like an external phenomena can't shift someone's narrative, in my view. An individual has to do the work to shift their own narrative, right? Like it has to be an intrinsic internal game. And that's why I like the concepts of crucibles. We have to create a test. We have to create something challenging enough that requires us to stretch to the extent that our values and our systems realign. And at first, it's a lot of willpower. Like we're going to be doing things that may not be natural in terms of what our narrative. But what starts to happen is as we do more and as we start to stretch, we start to tell ourselves, yes, we can. We start to have illustrative examples to ourselves that, yes, we can stretch and be successful. And that then starts to create and shift the narrative, right? So now we know, for instance, for me, I'm at a point where I knew I could do the burpees and I could attempt this world record, or anything else that's challenging that I value enough. I know I can do it. And the reason I know I can do it is I've got enough illustrative examples in my life that when I work towards something and when I put in the work and I'm willing to do what's necessary, I will get there. It may not look the way I think it'll look. The path may not look and feel the way I thought it would look or feel, but history tells me. And that's how my narrative works. And the reason my narrative has become like it is, where historically it was crazy dysfunctional, and it still can be dysfunctional at times at any period in the day. But in the main, my narrative is moving me towards positivity. And that's because I've got the history there. I've got the runs on the board. I've proved to myself. We've got to prove to ourselves. And that's through doing.
Right. And fully agree with you. And, I need to find a crucible. I've actually got my board up here on the side here, and it says, what's my next epic shit? Like, what's the next thing that I'm going to do that's epic, like that next crucible? But I also wonder, with setting those really high, hard goals, how often do people get discouraged by setting those really high, hard goals, and then they go, let's say, for instance, somebody wants to go and run a 50 miler, and they go out and they run 2 miles, and it's hard for them. And how do you get people past that initial struggle with the smaller chunks and convince them that, hey, those are just little stepping stones and they all add up?
Yeah. I think what people need to realize, and I tell people in recovery this, newcomers, like people trying to get sober, you better expect that it's going to suck. All right. And you better, we talk about it in our text group, embrace the suck. Like, it's cliche, but it's real. Like, when something sucks and it's that hard, and you're running your 2 miles and you're like, man, this sucks, you should know you're becoming a better and stronger and faster human. You are becoming better. And that should drive you and fuel you to continue.
Right.
So I'd say that one thing that I know is whenever I'm doing something I did a 4.5 hour burpee session the other day, and I'm doing burpees right now at a rate, the rate that I'm doing burpees is far faster and harder than what I'll need to do to break the world record. Sure. So I'm just testing my physicality, right? So I was doing sets of 100, right? And at somewhere around 4 hours, I'm alone, I'm in a park, it's freezing cold. My house is literally across the road. I can walk home, no one will know. It's worse than running, because with running, at least you're moving. But right. I knew at that point that next half hour was going to be where I expanded my horizons. I knew, and I had faith and trust that next half hour, where I was now at the edge of my comfortability, I was at the very edge, that next half hour was going to really, really suck. But I have faith and trust that suck and that half hour of pure hell is going to be where the gold is. And I think what I'm trying to say is people need to get comfortable with the path that is going to be uncomfortable and accept that very quickly. Don't make yourself think it's going to be sunshines and rainbows and like a motivational video song. It's not going to be that. It is literally not going to be that. But you got to have trust and faith that sign that it sucks so bad that you just want to stop is actually telling you there's gold there. And that's got to mean something to you. If that doesn't mean something to you, you don't value this whole process. You don't value it enough.
Right. Right. And I love the way that you phrased that. You said, if you continue to push, you're going to become a better human. You didn't say you're going to become a faster runner or a better runner. You said that you're going to become a better human. And when we push ourselves past our perceived boundaries, then we can become stronger mentally and emotionally and spiritually, so that we are better humans, so that we're tougher humans, and we get used to being uncomfortable. Now, at the same time, I know I call this thing, so many motivational videos are out there saying, hey, you need to wake up at 3 a.m. and then crush your soul for 28 hours out of the 24 in a day. And I call that grind porn. And, that's, hey, you have to grind. But I think at the same time as working hard and pushing yourself past your perceived limits, you have to also be aware of your humanity, and know that resting at some times is going to be good for you. Otherwise, you're going to reach that point of diminishing returns. So how do you, RJ, talking to our listeners, balance, pushing yourself past those perceived those perceived limits while balancing some level of rest for your mental and physical wellness?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've become better at that, right? Like, for instance, I was sick for a few weeks, and like I didn't do any training, and then I started to do light training on like the third week because I knew like I needed to move on. Back in the day, as an ultra runner, that would have drove me crazy. And
Sure.
when you're running crazy distances, you're always on the knife edge of being sick, and then you've got a race coming up, and you start to stress out, and then you'll start running too early, and you'll get even sicker.
Right,
Um,
right.
I think that has come with age. I'm 41, right? Like some of that edge is off, and I think age has come to play a big part in it. Maybe a bit of wisdom. I don't know. My people around you might tell you differently. I With the burpees, I do 1 week on, 1 week off.
Wow.
Right. So the week that I'm off is all about um, almost like yoga and Pilates. Like it's strengthening my body and the frame for what's required for the week to come. And that for me is a week off, right? Like, so rest is part of performance. And I think the way that we need to look at rest is not taking your foot off the pedal. We have to frame it to ourselves in a way that rest is actually increasing the capacity.
Right.
And when you start to look at it that way, you shift the narrative, right? From like, oh shit, I'm not doing something, I'm being lazy, to no, I'm actually re-energizing and reinvigorating myself so that I can actually perform better in those moments. So I think reframing it, looking at it differently is important. And I think one of the good things is we are living in an era. Yes, there's still the grind culture out there, but there's a lot more research and there's a lot more discussion around the power of rest and energy management, which for me is huge.
Oh, absolutely.
Energy
And
management.
uh, yeah, and I love that you brought in the fact that you're building your body, you're building your structure so that you can handle the load that you're going to put on it the following week. I recently got a study sent to me from a friend. The study was conducted at Microsoft, and now this is not a physical study, but it's a mental study. They assessed the level of stress in a mind of these individuals who had back to back to back to back Zoom calls throughout the day, which has become like the norm, right? So many people, when I jump on a Zoom call, people will jump on 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes late, and their typical excuse or typical reason is that they were just wrapping up a previous call. And in this study, it shows that the stress levels of those people who have back to back to back Zoom calls continues to escalate through the day. And with those stress levels, it becomes, you get a lack of fulfillment, a lack of focus, a lack of energy, and you reach those diminishing returns very quickly. So yes, your example is a body, but we're also doing the same things with our minds by pushing ourselves past these limits without taking the rest that we need, physically, the rest that we need mentally, emotionally, spiritually. But it sounds like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth here. I'm trying not to, and I'm trying to be clear. I may be failing, but we need to, yes, push ourselves past those perceived limits regularly. But as you said, RJ, with time, with experience, with wisdom, I think you also realize that you end up at some point getting those diminishing returns. And at that point, you need to take a step back and find out where you can implement rest, whether that's physical rest, by taking a week off, whether that's mental rest by taking 5-10 minutes in between Zoom calls, whether that's emotional, spiritual rest, whatever that looks like for you. But I also believe that is going to help you to live more mindfully and attain those moments of clarity that we come full circle back to what helped you to get onto the path that you're on now. If you had just been crushing yourself doing physical training while you were doing while you were drinking as heavily as you were, while you were dealing drugs, while you were using drugs, you may not have had those moments of clarity or that moment of clarity, or may not have even realized it. So I fully believe that there is that balance. You have to push yourself past the limits, but you also need to realize that there's a level of rest that you need physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. Now I've gone on my long
no.
monologue there.
I think that was that. I think that's well informed, and it's being skillful, right? Like it's knowing when to sharpen the blade and when to put it in the scabbard, right? Like you
Yep.
can't be sharpening the blade, and you can't have your blade out all the time. Like when you have it
Right.
out, it has to have be meaningful and have impact. And I think that's 100% right on the money. I think that you see a lot of people in the ultra endurance community, and they do well, I think, for a time. Like I know people that are just time on feet, they're just doing 100-mile races every month or every other month. But the compounded time, I feel and believe, will have a massively negatively impact on everything, not only their body, but their time with the family and the things that matter. And we have to know what matters, and we have to
Yep.
value, like for instance, if I didn't have kids and a wife, and I was just doing business and running, I could probably go much harder with the running. I certainly could, actually. But I
Sure.
also know these long runs on Sundays, I come back tired, I come back grumpy. Do I want my kids to remember me that way? Do I also want them to resent running? Because
Right.
I don't want them to, right? Like, oh, dad goes, he comes back pissed off and tired, and my wife, and like,
Sure.
it's just one of those things that we have to really be clear on. And I can quite easily go over the edge. And sometimes I let myself, like when I was doing that 4.5 hour burpee session, that last half hour, I wanted to, and I was very intentional about going over the edge and going to another place. But we can't stay there.
Mm-hmm.
We can't stay there. We got to come back. If we don't, it's I don't think we can stay in that place of hyper performance, or in this context, we don't even call it performance. It's just redlining. I don't believe we can live there and be there successfully whilst having a relationship with a wife and kids
No,
and people. I just don't think it works.
I agree. I think, the like you said at the very beginning, if that's what you do, if that's what you devote your life to completely, then a lot of the people in your life are going to go away. Well, the same thing can be said for work. So many people devote themselves to working 18, 19-hour days, and they convince themselves that they're doing it for their family, while at the same time they're completely neglecting their family, right? And I think a lot of the time it's actually ego that's driving them to do that. And that ego can come into play in the workplace. That ego can come into place with ultra endurance
Mm.
athletes. It can come into play, all over the place. But we have to make sure that our ego is in check. Now that, again, coming full circle, comes into play with the habits, right? The habits, the ego can take us either way. The ego, we can be so convinced that we can kick the bad habits that we don't put in the work to actually kick that habit and end up not kicking it because we haven't put in the work. Or vice versa, we have a negative ego, we have a very low self-esteem, and we never even try to kick the habit. We convince ourselves, well, I didn't do X, Y, or Z properly. I try to give up smoking 500 times. I try to go on a diet. I try to, I don't know, you name it. And you convince yourself, again, coming back to that negative narrative, that you can't do something. So the ego can definitely come into play either way, positively or negatively, in those breaking and setting habits.
Mm. I think, and that's where I think it's really important, particularly if you're moving from a state of dysfunction out of dysfunction. Like for me, when let's talk about cigarettes. Like
Yeah.
the when I quit drinking, the I started to base my idealized self on people like Matthew, that the dude who's mentoring me, and like he ate healthy, he didn't smoke, and then I started to realize top tier people were living like that. So
Mm-hmm.
my ego then realigned with my desire to see myself as a performer, and part of that was stopping smoking, right? So like in many ways, because my idealized self, which was a function of my ego, started to evolve into what does a successful entrepreneur businessman actually look like, and it started to get crystal clear based on the examples of humans that were around me that were successful in that space, and noticing that none of them were smoking. And so in many ways, my ego served me well, because it was like, I want to move towards that. I want to become that. And smoking isn't part of that. Smoking isn't part of that. And that desire to realize that identity outweighed the immediate desire to smoke, really, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's the ability, like you said at the very beginning, to see the person that you could be versus the person that you were, and know that there's a delta there between the two, and that delta is going to require a lot of work to get from the person that you are to the person that you want to be. RJ, this is awesome, man. I really appreciate everything that we've covered thus far. We're coming up on the end of our scheduled time. I know you've got this world record attempt coming up. When is that? And how can people support you, and what's it for? I know we haven't even covered that. So would you jump into that really quickly? Tell our audience what that's for, when it is, and how they can support you?
Yeah, so the date will be determined when I get back from holiday next week. It's going to be around October, November, December. It is a Guinness Book World Record attempt for 24-hour burpees, which I'm going to aim for 11,000. And we're trying to raise money for charity for Black Dog Institute, which is the only research institute here in Australia in the mental health space. So they are scientifically driven, and what they do is they research mental health, Black Dog Institute, and then they help implement programs across the country. And so this is an attempt not only for my own self, I suppose, elevating myself. It was born out of a bit of a patchy period I went through when we moved to this new state that we live in. It was kind of a lot of culminated change, a challenging period. It was a real cold time where I couldn't go outside, and I just started doing burpees. And then I realized that this was it. This was the new crucible, so to speak. And so I wanted to do it not only for myself, but to help benefit others in the mental health space. So I will be focusing on the date of the execution, probably announcing that sometime when I get back from holiday, mid-June. But the aim will be right, before the end of the calendar year. And it's in an attempt to break the Guinness Book of World Record for 24-hour burpees.
Right on, brother. And I'll make sure that that link for Black Dog Institute is in the show notes. And if you would, after this, send me the link so that people can help to support that. That'd be great. I'll make sure that's in the show notes too. And we help to support that, because it is definitely a virtuous effort that you're going after, and a virtuous program that you're supporting. So thank you for what it is you're doing, RJ. And thank you for being with us here today, man. I really appreciate you. If people wanted to get a hold of you outside of the burpee challenge, if people wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So whether it's the burpee challenge or just to get a hold of me, it's at my website at www.ultrahabits.co.
Right on, man. And I know you're on social media with LinkedIn, and I've seen you on the other social media platforms out there too. So we're looking forward to seeing you go after that record, and we look forward to seeing you break it, brother. So, for our audience, this has been one of those weird shows, right? Will dropped in, dropped out. We had audio problems, but hey, it is what it is. We roll with it, and we accept it for what it is, because we are human beings, and we appreciate your guys' patience with us. We appreciate you, RJ, for sharing everything that you've shared with us about setting new habits and breaking the bad ones. And if this show resonated with you as an audience, please share it with your friends, your family, your colleagues, whomever may need to hear it. We appreciate you, and until next time, take care.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you walk away with some new tools and insights to guide you on your life journey. New episodes are being published every week, so please join us again for some meaningful discussion. For more information, please check out mentalkingmindfulness.com.